And it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to welcome you to this special meeting of the Friday Colloquium Series in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Memphis. Today's event is being generously co-sponsored by the Marcus Orr Center for Humanities. The subject of today's event is the history and philosophy of Black Lives Matter. Our guests today are Dr. Anika Simpson and Dr. Charles McKinney. Anika Simpson is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Morgan State University. She also served as the coordinator of MSU's Women and Gender Studies program, which was established under her leadership, and was co-chair of the LGBTQA Advisory Council. Her publications have primarily focused upon Black feminism and African American philosophy. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled Single Black Mother: Queer Reflections on Marriage and Racial Justice. Welcome, Dr. Simpson.
Thank you.
Dr. Charles McKinney is the Neville Fearson Bryan Chair of Africana Studies and an Associate Professor of History at Rhodes College. He's the author of Greater Freedom: The Evolution of the Civil Rights Struggle in Wilson, North Carolina, and the editor with Aram Gazouzian of An Unseen Light: Black Struggles for Freedom in Memphis, Tennessee, an exploration of the Black freedom struggle from Reconstruction to the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. I first hatched this idea with Dr. McKinney, and I'm very happy that he agreed to be a part of it. Welcome, Dr. McKinney.
Very happy to be here.
For this colloquium, we've asked each of our speakers to prepare in advance an answer to an opening question, for which they will have approximately 8 to 10 minutes to answer. After that, we'll move into a more open discussion through a series of questions for both speakers to answer, which my colleague in African American Studies, Dr. Ladrika Medson-Fur, and I have worked together to formulate. Then we'll leave the final 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And again, for that last part, if you will please type your questions as they occur to you into the chat function, and Dr. Medson-Fur will select questions to ask directly to the speakers. In the minds of many, Black Lives Matter is one of, if not the most important issue of 2020. Names like Daniel Prude, Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tanisha Anderson, and Tamir Rice have become familiar to Americans, and as we know, are only some of the most famous or most recent names in a long, damning, and painful history of violence against Black people in this country. They are also names that have become synonymous with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has galvanized people of all races and backgrounds, some for its call to activism, social justice, and police reform, and some in opposition to those same objectives. Dr. McKinney, can you tell us a little bit about how the Black Lives Matter movement came about, but especially how it relates to other important civil rights or activist movements in American history? And is it correct to call it a movement, or is there a better way to conceptualize it, historically speaking?
Really looking forward to us, all of us sort of jumping in and having a larger conversation. So I'll start with the second question first, because that one's easier to answer. Yes, this is a movement, right? Let's just be clear about that. Moments grow into movements, right? And so there have been multiple moments over the course of the last decade, we could say, that have served as triggering points to get us to these larger, to get us to this larger movement, right? So I think that language is entirely appropriate, right? When you have people marching on all of the populated continents on the planet, using similar phrases and using similar words, marching around similar issues, right? When you've got people in Australia, New Zealand, in England, in Portugal, in the United States, in Brazil, right? In Ecuador, right? You know, in Canada, when you have people literally all across the globe marching in the name of and protesting in the name of some very specific things, I think we have to be okay with using the language of movement, right? And those marches also being directed to address very specific problems, right? These aren't just simply marches just for the sake of marching, right? People are engaged in these activities for fun, right? They're engaged in these activities to address very particular societal ills, very particular structural realities, right? So I think yes, we can certainly use the language of movement to talk about this moment. And so to the initial question of how this moment came about. As a historian, I need a solid 45 minutes to give us all the historical context, right? In terms of how we got here, how we arrived at this moment. But I'll boil it down to a couple of moments, a couple of places and spaces that we can certainly think about. And that first space is Florida, 2012. George Zimmerman murders Trayvon Martin, who is carrying, a soft drink and some Skittles, walking back to his father's apartment. Zimmerman murders Trayvon Martin. There is a howl of protest over social media. That protest generates enough pressure to actually get Zimmerman arrested, and then he is acquitted in 2013. And it is in the wake of this moment that Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and others come up with this hashtag, right? Black Lives Matter. And this hashtag, right, blows up on Twitter, blows up on the internet, and is used as a rhetorical rallying tool, rhetorical rallying cry. Black Lives Matter. And again, this is in direct response to the fact that George Zimmerman could kill Trayvon Martin and then still be home in time for dinner. And then Mike Brown is murdered in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And this is when we see the concept of Black Lives Matter move, in the words of Alicia Garza, right, move from hashtag to social media into the streets, right? We see this movement, right? And this is also a really interesting time. We see the birthing of it. We see the birth of a movement, right? And we also have an opportunity when we go back and excavate. And I got to give a shout out to Barbara Ransby and Keonga Yamada Taylor and Angela Davis and a host of other scholars who have really tried to excavate this moment and try to make meaning and make sense of this moment in terms of showing us what some of the antecedents are to this moment. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is the genesis, right? The physical genesis, right? Where again we move from a hashtag on social media out into the streets. And so Ferguson jumps off in some really profound and powerful ways. And so one of the ways we can think about Black Lives Matter is, I think of it at least, in terms of BLM being an articulation, a radical articulation of Black humanity in the face of anti-Black racist atrocity, right? Again, a radical articulation of Black humanity in the face of anti-Black racist atrocity. And I think this is a dynamic that has to be fully contended with as we seek to illuminate the history and genealogy of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter gives light to the deep and deeply normalized structural realities of anti-Black policy and the anti-Blackness of the nation writ large, right? And so when we think about antecedents, right, when we think about the context in which these killings are happening and all of these other killings, right? Remy, you mentioned all of these other killings. My wife and I have two sons, 20 and 16. And when I have this conversation with my 20-year-old, he marks like the rings of a tree. Okay, when I was 12, Trayvon Martin. When I was 13, 14, Mike Brown, Renisha Boyd, on and on and on and on, right? So this is definitely an entryway, a flashpoint, right? But these are flashpoints that lead to an understanding and an analysis, critical analysis, larger structural realities. And so some of the antecedents, Barbara Ransby suggests some of the descendants, right, earlier descendants of this moment in terms of how do we get a Black Lives Matter, and in particular, how do we get a trio of three queer Black women thinking about movement work, thinking about social change, thinking about and honoring the Black radical tradition, right? Some of the antecedents we see are the HIV and AIDS activists, Black HIV and AIDS activists, right, who are knocking around starting in the 1980s all across the country, thinking about how that epidemic, right, how Black folks had been written out of, right, have been written out of the narrative, have been written out of the help, right, been written out of the aid, have been sort of excised from the narrative of HIV and AIDS, right? So HIV and AIDS activists, activists who started organizing in the wake of Katrina, right? And also that moment and other moments revealing the deep structural disparities we have in our society. Also the Black Radical Congress, a place and space where the radical left tried to sort of reclaim a space apart from the Black left, right? And so these are a couple of places and spaces we can go in terms of thinking about some of the antecedents, some of the things that give rise to, right, a context in which three queer radical Black women can start thinking about a very coherent tradition, a Black feminist radical tradition, right? That they can cohere around, and then that they can then ultimately build a movement around. So the other part of the question, there's a long list, a long place, a long chain of events, right? There's lots of places and spaces in history where we see people engaged in the radical articulation of Black humanity in the face of anti-Black racist atrocity, right? This happens from 1619 to yesterday, right? So there's other places and spaces. And again, the emphasis here for me is on atrocity, right? Because one of the things that Black Lives Matter is doing is shining a light on the atrocity that so many of us now view as normative, right? And we have to understand how atrocious, how monstrous these realities, these anti-Black realities are, right? So when we go back to abolition, right? The normative way in which, right, the bondage of Black people is taken, right? And the ways in which abolitionists say, no, actually, this is monstrous behavior. Actually, the monsters in this scenario are not, right, are not the Africans, are not the Negroes, right? The monstrous behavior are the people who are selling other people, right? So again, this radical articulation of Black humanity in the period of lynching, right? What we see here is an absence of the police and the facilitation of anti-Black structural racism, right? The cops, when I show images or partial images of lynchings, my students invariably ask, well, where are the police? And I say, the police are there, they're running crowd control, right? So let's think about the atrocity, right? The effect that 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people can come and attend the murder of a Black man, woman, or child, right? Again, because again, right, Black men, women, and children were all subject to this, right? So again, the casual nature of Black death, right? The governor of the state of Florida sending best wishes to the lynch mob in the wake of a lynching in Florida in 1920, 1921, right? The riots that take place in Atlanta, Georgia, the Chicago riot of 1919 during Bloody Summer, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the basis of a recent TV show, right? These are instances where, again, these trigger points of police brutality are made evident. But those trigger points also lead to the illumination of larger structural realities, larger anti-Black structural realities that activists in those moments are also seeking to articulate and lay claim to and to counter. As we move into the civil rights period, again, the proclaiming of Black humanity, the proclaiming of equality, right? This radical assertion in the midst of atrocity, right? The white reaction in the wake of the Brown decision, right? The violence perpetrated on Black communities in that moment has been normalized, right? We see the grainy images of police dogs, and we see the grainy images of blown up churches, right? And one of the things that we've been desensitized to, right, is the fact in which these are state-sanctioned actions, right? These are actions that are going on that are either perpetrated by the state or are given the explicit blessing by the state, right? And so, again, activists laying claim to the humanity of Black folks, but also trying to illuminate the racist atrocity of an entrenched an entrenched system, right? These are all the antecedents of the Black Lives Matter moment. And then finally, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, right? Breonna Taylor, right? You know, the most recent spate of racial murders, right? The atrocity here is readily apparent, right? You can kill Black people, men, women, or children, right? Agents of the state or private citizens can kill Black people in the afternoon and still be at home in time for dinner, right? So the atrocity there is not simply the killing, right? The atrocity there is also the fact that in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it takes 3 district attorneys for us to find a district attorney that will finally say, you know what, maybe we should arrest somebody, right? So again, the illumination of the atrocity. In Ferguson, right, the Justice Department finds out that the police department is basically using Black people to generate revenue, right? You know, we're gonna have budget shortfalls, and so we need you to go out and you know, and write this amount of tickets. We need you to go out and levy this amount of fines. And so using poor and working class Black people as the ATM machine for the city of Ferguson, right? This is racist atrocity. So again, it's not just about Mike Brown, right? But it's also, again, the illumination of the systems and structures in place that give rise to incidents like Mike Brown, the systems and structures in place that give rise to these titanic, deep and abiding structural inequalities, right? And figuring out a way to try to lay claim to and try to build a movement that addresses not just the flashpoints of police brutality and police murder, but also these larger structural realities. So that's that. That's my piece. That's my argument, and I'm sticking with it. So I'm done.
Thank you so much. I have a feeling we'll come back to a few of those issues as we go. One of my follow-up questions, I think, will bring us back to that contrast between mundanity and what's the normal and the atrocity. So thank you. Dr. Simpson, turning to you, is there a core unified philosophy to the Black Lives Matter movement as it exists today? Or is it an accidental convergence of different philosophies that have been brought together for pragmatic or political reasons? Obviously, some of what Dr. McKinney said maybe touches on that. And is that philosophy, if there is a philosophy, is it primarily moral or political or something else entirely?
First, let me say thank you for the invitation. I am back home with my alma mater. I've carried barbecue and blues and bourbon with me since I left Memphis. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And also I'm thrilled to be sharing time with Dr. McKinney, whose reputation has preceded him. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to chop it up with him too. So to begin addressing the question, I would begin by saying that a unifying theme within Africana philosophy is the exploration of freedom and liberation in the wake of colonization, conquest, and anti-Black racism. And as Lewis Gordon has said, Africana phenomenology as a relational activity is one of expanding options in a world where the lack thereof leads to meaningless choices and consequently human suffering. Joy James considers Black philosophy to serve as both as a corrective and creative source for political theory and philosophy. So for James, Black philosophy approaches the life of the mind through the struggle for freedom as a concrete form of resistance to anti-Black racism. So to that end, I say that the pursuit of liberation or the movement for Black lives is a concretized manifestation of the work of Black philosophy. I mean, this is Black philosophy. So in this sense, the movement for Black lives is offering very, sorry about that, I'm outside the helicopter, maybe Trump, I don't know. In a sense, the movement for Black lives is offering varied responses to the capital P of philosophical questions, pertaining to topics like justice and ethics and human dignity and political and state power. And I have to say, of less interest to me today, parse out how this dynamic and contemporary social movement fits within the confines of our professional or academic modes of philosophizing. I think for me, what's of most interest is trying to flesh out what lessons we can gain from the movement, or what does the movement give to us as Black philosophers who are committed to Black liberty. I'm going to offer 3 points that are short, and then we can get into a deeper conversation. So I think the first thing that the Black Lives Matter movement points out for us that we need to be cognizant of centers around gender and sexuality. And I'm taking the Black Youth Project 100 as a case study. So BYP 100 was a study that was brought about by Kathy Cohen and was established after the BYP 100 work was done. So I actually had the chance to bring in members of the DC chapter into my classroom, and we co-taught a class where I did some of the theory and they work with students to develop an activist project. So it was a very fruitful experience to see how Black philosophy actually works in real time with activists on the ground. BYP 100 is committed to abolitionism, anti-capitalism, and they center their organizational work squarely upon a Black queer feminist lens. In her book, Unapologetic, Black Queer and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movement, Charlene Carruthers, who was the founding director, national director of BYP 100, defines his organizing lens as a political practice based in Black feminist and LGBTQ traditions and knowledge, through which people and groups see to bring their full selves into the process of dismantling all systems of oppression. Now, the problem of gender in philosophy has been engaged since Anna Julia Cooper had her 19th century call for Black men to take an interest in women outside of their aesthetic appreciation. And we have contemporary philosopher Christy Dodson, who has offered us a compelling argument against intellectual slumming, or that tendency for some philosophers to say they do race work, but they do not do gender work. So in the same way as the Black feminist philosophies understand that gender is a constitutive aspect of racial identity, Black queer theorists have also made the case that sexuality is not a derivative or additive to racial identity. And while the influence of Black queer theory is evident across many academic disciplines, Africana philosophy has yet to substantively address the topic of sexuality itself, let alone queerness. And I think this sidelining of Black queer folks and TAGNC folks within Africana philosophy and the absence of work grounded in Black feminist and LGBTQ traditions undermines the emancipatory import of our work. So I think it was interesting with Dr. McKinney, the people he listed were Black queer women who have been very influential in the movement for Black lives. And I think Africana philosophy needs to follow that lead. Second point I think we need to be attentive to, which also came up in the earlier remarks, is looking at liberal democracy versus radical democracy. So the movement for Black Lives and BYP, as I said, are abolitionist and anti-capitalist movements. And their freedom dreams included a vision of abolitionist or radical democracy and not liberal democracy. So that's what Angela Davis argues for, abolition democracy. Now, Charlene Carruthers says that one of the collective commitments that the movement must, is that it must regenerate is combating liberalism with principled struggle. And she identifies liberalism as the greatest threat to movement building and antithetical to collective liberation. And as was mentioned, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor says that in earlier eras, freedom was imagined as inclusion within mainstream America, including admittance to its political and financial institutions. And for her, the future of Black liberation is bound with social transformation. And for those of you who are familiar with Black philosophy, there are a number of noted Africana philosophers who are beholden to liberalism and advocate for Black radical liberalism. And I think that we need to grapple with the possibility that this political or moral allegiance may be out of step with the contemporary radical movements for Black liberation. And the final thought that I will leave that I think Black philosophers need to be attentive to is how, and also activists on the ground, are the relationships between Black liberation movements and in the movements for indigenous sovereignty. So the commitment for me is a commitment to the realization of human liberation, and that is not exclusive to Black people. And if we're going to confront US imperialism, I think that necessitates attention to the triad of settler, native, and slave. As Justin Leroy has said, the U.S. emerged as a racist capitalist settler state through the simultaneous operation of colonialism and anti-Blackness. And I think we need to take seriously how those two modes of oppression work to support one another. So I think thinking through the complexity of Black folks who were forcibly brought to America and now consider Turtle Island as home, we need to ask ourselves what kind of relationships we want to have with Indigenous people. And where are there opportunities for coalitional political and ethical praxis in the quest for liberation? Otherwise, as Zainab Madahi and Bonita Lawrence have contend, failures, they say, to negotiate settlers, complicit in the extermination of those whose lands they occupy. So I'll just close by saying that I think the movement for Black lives has significant philosophical import. And I also think that it is fertile ground for us as we continue to think through Africana philosophy's contributions to the quest for Black liberation.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to move into a more open discussion. And the first question that I have, that's a question for both of you, I think we'll pick up on various aspects of your remarks in the first segment there, Anika, about what you think some of the core issues are or ought to be. So I had asked Dr. McKinney specifically how Black Lives Matter relates to prior civil rights movements. But I'd like to ask you both whether you think civil rights as a conceptual term is a fitting one for Black Lives Matter movement. If not, does it seem that it represents, that is, Black Lives Matter represents more different issues than civil rights? And I think some of what you both said sort of suggested as much, and I'd be curious how you answer that question. Anika, do you want to go first?
Sure. In preparation for this, I called one of my friends who works with BYP 100 in DC to ask about this, because I was going through the Movement for Black Lives website, and I was looking at, we had these policy agendas, and we want to get the Breathe Act legislation passed. Like, I thought you all were abolitionists. What's happening? So I think part of the difference that I see between a civil rights movement and what's happening right now is that she was saying that we have to deal with electoral politics. This is where we are. So she's like, yes, we want to burn down Congress, but we have not prepared the ground for that to happen tomorrow. So I think there's a difference between wanting to have, we need to fight to have more Black senators, we need to fight to have more Black governors, versus we need to work with the system that we have as we are working to tear it down. So that platform of divest, invest, I think, I don't know if you're all familiar with it, like divest from policing, that's from structures that are antithetical to Black wellness and wholeness, and invest in Black sustainability, and which is different, I think, than just saying that we want to put it within mainstream liberal democracy.
Charles? Chuck?
So, Dr. Simpson pretty much nailed it all down, right? But historically, right, this has been a perennial tension. Right, that tension between inclusion and the radical revisioning of systems and structures, right? What do we want to do, right? And folks at all venues and in all moments, right? People understand these dynamics, right? You know, Martin King very explicitly talks about, you know, I have the feeling that in this push for integration, we're trying to integrate. I'm trying to bring my people into a burning house, right? What's the alternative? Right? What are my alternatives? Right? And so it's the inside outside game that I think also frequently gives rise to the challenge. One of the challenges that we have is the recognition of the fluidity, right? Of what does it mean to be radical, right? You know, what does that entail, right? And so for the vast majority of the time Black folk have lived in North America, right? An inclusion into the mainstream of American life has been a radical act, right? What does it mean that for the vast majority of the time that that Black folk have been free, right, you could lose your life for trying to vote, right? What does it mean that the state can move against you in very explicit and particular ways if you try to do the things that white people do in American society? Right, are not lynched because they engaged in some sort of terrorist activity. They get murdered because of their successful pursuit of the American dream, right? Tommy Moss gets murdered because he's winning, right? So what does that mean? So how do we characterize that, right? So this is the tension, and I think that tension is also being made very evident now, right, in terms of how we're dealing with the contemporary moment. All of a sudden, folks are running around, what do you mean abolition? Abolition, what does this look like? What does this sound like, right? And so now we're starting to see, right, again, those tensions revisit themselves. And again, these are not new tensions, right? Amiri Baraka talked very eloquently in the latter part of the 60s, early part of the 70s about again, this inside-outside game, right? I'm not fond of Congress. I'm not fond of, right, the moving into the burning building, right? I think actually this is during the Reagan years, right? He was like, but there's people out here who are trying to get the Voting Rights Act revoked, right? So, I'm not, but so we're not in a position to ignore that. Right? We're not in a position to ignore the stripping away of basic rights, so that rendering us even less capable to enact the sorts of strategies that we would need to enact to build the type of world that we would want to build, right? So yes, I'm an abolitionist, and yes, I'm voting on November, yes, I'm voting in November, right? Because, being an abolitionist also means, right, having a sharp enough of a political analysis to know and understand that there are substantive differences between somebody, for instance, who would leave the Voting Rights Act alone and somebody who would want to chip away at the Voting Rights Act, or healthcare, or housing policy, right? All of the things that people are organizing around, right, to fight. Right, there are systems and structures in place that can give aid and comfort to those things. So again, it's a very, it's complicated. And again, this is a very long historical dialogue. But I think, and I'll say this is the last thing, but I think it's also really important for us to honor and recognize, right, the reality that that the radicals are the ones who are bringing us all of these possibilities, right, that are bringing us possibilities above and beyond the standard notions, right, in terms of inclusion, right? In the midst of the Obama moment, right, where we were, a whole bunch of folks were running around talking about we're in a post-racial society and other sorts of absurdities, right? That Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter doesn't get discovered during the Donald Trump administration, right? It doesn't happen during the Ronald Reagan administration, right? It happens during the Obama years, right? The first Black president of the United States that's when this is happening, right? And look at the ways in which he was constrained, right? He was incapable of speaking very explicitly and plainly and historically about what we saw when we saw Mike Brown be murdered, right? So again, there's that other, so to me, that's a really powerful example of, right, this tension between inclusion and the limits of inclusion, right? And the ways in which we should be thinking about the radical revisioning of the police, of prisons, and other sectors of our society.
That's really powerful, and I think it actually segues to the next question in a nice way. So just a couple of weeks ago, we had there was another Marcus Orr Center for the Humanities event where Nick Bacola was here to talk to us about his book, The Fire is Upon Us, which if you haven't had a chance to look at is the history of the debate between William Buckley and James Baldwin. And it was a fascinating discussion. And at one point in that discussion, my colleague in English, Dr. Terrence Tucker, and if he's here, he might be able to remind me of the exact wordings, but he asked Nick whether he thought we needed a new vocabulary. If part of the lessons of thinking back on Baldwin, if maybe that's partly what, and I hear some of that in the kinds of comments that both of you are making about the kinds of space that the radical elements of Black philosophy are opening up, the conceptual spaces that they're opening up. And so I guess just to focus the question a bit more, do you think, or what's your thought on how the Black Lives Matter movement is influencing the concepts of vocabulary that we use today to talk about social justice or racism? And Charles, you want to take this one, and then we'll come back to Anika.
So I'm always leery of calls for new vocabulary, right? They always make me suspicious, because over the course of 300 years, we've employed new vocabulary, right? We've employed different types of vocabulary to address central problems, and it doesn't speak to the issues of power, right? Vocabulary doesn't speak to the issues of I have these things, and I don't care how you water down the words. I'm not giving you the things that I have, right? I'm not giving you extra resources for public education. I'm not giving you extra resources for housing or for healthcare. I'm not giving you extra resources for homeless services. I'm going to give more money for more cops on the street. I don't care what language you use, right? The language of the language of Christianity. Am I not a man and a brother? Said the abolitionists during slavery, and half of the country said we don't care, right? Accessing the language of equality, accessing the language of it's not racism, it's implicit bias. Accessing the language, most of the shifts in language I see are concessions to power, right? And are concessions to a status quo that has not moved with the employment of other sorts of methods, of other types of language. And so the continual sort of restructuring and rephrasing of language, right? In most instances, I would say, right, particularly in the mainstream, right? That's a recognition of, right? That's a concession to power, right? So when we talk about implicit bias on college campuses, what we talk about is racism, right? We're talking about white supremacy. We're talking about homophobia, right? There are no queer people in these spaces because we don't want any queer people in these spaces. That's not oops, there's no queer people. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is, yes, I know there are queer people out in the world. We don't want them in our spaces, period. Ask me another question, right? So, what's the language? So what type of language do we use to address this issue of power, right? To address this issue of intentional subordination, right? There's only so much pretty talk that you can generate in order to address these central questions.
Thanks.
For McKinney on that, I think for me, it's not so much that we need a new vocabulary. I think we need a reawakening of political imagination and freedom dreaming. I went back to Rob and Gigi Kelly's Freedom Dreams over the summer. I've dedicated my career to working within Blacks. Resignation amongst my students, which is understandable, or complacency in certain instances, or just kind of feel like, how much more can we take? What else can we do? And so for me, it's not so much a need for new words or new language or new vocabulary. I mean, I think it's a matter of maintaining the dream and the vision that liberation is realizable, and that it's not something that is that we need to give up on.
Thanks. I want to remind everybody in the audience that as you're starting to think about questions of your own, please start putting them into the chat. We'll be coming to that point soon where I turn it over over to you to ask questions of our speakers. So please take advantage. While we're speaking about language, and so both of your answers I found, really profound in different ways, about being wary of new vocabularies. But I also wonder about what else we should be wary about in language around the Black Lives Matter movement. So, here's an example from my past week. I was listening to NPR do its local fundraising. We're in that fall fundraising campaign, and the national voice came on of a pre-recorded clip of somebody saying why they encouraging people to contribute money and why they should contribute money. And they talked about how NPR keeps them up to date on the most important issues of the day. And they said, like COVID and the political election and social unrest. And I was immediately paused because I thought, social unrest, is there some other unrest besides what's related to Black Lives Matter that I'm not aware of? And I wasn't sure what to make of that. I mean, I could sort of make some guesses, but I guess I'm curious what you make of it and whether you would think of that as some kind of code switching, and whether there's any other kind of code switching going on around Black Lives Matter that people listening to this, it might help them to think about. Anika?
Thinking about this question, it made me think of something that's related, which I'll get to and then answer the NPR question. So I've been thinking a lot about civil violence and disciplinary regulation when it comes to sexuality of Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And I think part of the policing of Black people is us having to wear a mask. Because I can see one of the questions about Black anger, Black rage, like we need to put on Black people often talk about putting a mask in white spaces. So we put on a mask at work. So we don't actually share who we are completely in mixed spaces. And I think that's what you see with NPR. So you wouldn't say Black Lives Matter, you might just say social unrest as part of that disciplinary regulation, because you don't want to upset something. I kind of say in the menu of services that white privilege affords is that you don't have to deal with Black anger or Black rage or anything that you find unpalatable. And that's kind of the box that I put that NPR statement on, where you wouldn't say Black Lives Matter directly, because that might be upsetting to some. So something's going on. You can't deny something's happening. So we'll call it social unrest, which I kind of put akin to that mask that many of us have to wear in professional spaces, or when there's a differential in power and you might be a little concerned about your job or things of that nature.
Thanks. Charles?
I think this is, the NPR example to me is just another clear way in which language is used to dilute and divert, and to move away from. I think you're absolutely right. The central area of social unrest right now centers very much on, on the question of black people, right? The question of Black Lives Matter, right? The question of structural racism, right? And so we're not going to say those words on national public radio, right? We're just not, right? And thinking of language, right? One of the things I noticed a couple of weeks ago was watching television. Like one day a week I watch television, and all of the commercials that came on talked about how tough this moment is, but none of these commercials mentioned COVID. Right? None of the commercials say corona, right? None of the commercials say virus, right? And so I think it's a very similar dynamic, right? Reality gets politicized in a particular sort of way, so that, we're going to acknowledge that this is a rough moment, but we're not going to mention the words coronavirus. We're not going to mention the word COVID. We're not going to mention, pandemic. We're not going to talk about why we're all inside. Right? We're not going to talk about why we all need something else to do because we're stuck inside. We're just going to acknowledge that we're all stuck inside, right? So again, this is language that is, that obscures. This is language that is not getting us where we need to go. And so, yeah, we have to be careful because this is also part of the work, right? Is to use both old and new language, right, to talk about the moment, and to say that, hey, you know what? No, we don't need to change that portion of the language, because that portion hasn't changed, right? You know, so that reality, that dynamic that we're fighting against in Ferguson or that we're fighting against in wherever, right? You know, those dynamics have not changed, right? So we don't need new language here, right? Maybe in some other places and spaces, but not to talk about these very particular things.
Thank you. And I see questions starting to come in. So this will be my last question, and then let audience talk. I'm curious if you might leave us, I mean, not leave us because we're going to keep having you talk, but I mean, in this portion of the colloquium, if you might leave us with your thoughts on whether there's a particular lesson that you think people are generally missing when they think or talk about Black Lives Matter, something that, I mean, that you would have people pay more attention to. And on that same note, I'm curious whether you think that if there is a lesson we're missing, is there any lesson is it the same lesson for all people? That is there maybe one lesson that you would call people of color, Black and brown people, to listen to, and a different lesson that you think white people are missing and they should listen to? Don't feel the need to tackle that whole question, but I'd be curious to know what you think on that. And we'll start with Charles and then end with Anika.
So one of the great myths of white supremacy is that you can build a white supremacist society and there are no repercussions for white people, right? You know, I think just to put it succinctly, right, the way your society has been ordered, if we don't change it, it will be the death of us all, right? You know, white supremacy is like, well, you know what, the hole in the boat is on their end of the boat. So I don't have to worry about that hole because that hole is not on my end of the boat, right? So my end of the boat's gonna be fine. That end of the boat, they're knee deep in water on that end, but I'm gonna be okay over here on my end, right? That's white supremacy, right? That's how our society is currently structured, right? It's currently ordered, right? You know, I don't want Obamacare because that's for poor, lazy, colored people, but that's also the exact same benefit that's making sure that if my husband dies of black lung, and I live in West Virginia, if my husband dies of black lung, the Obamacare makes it so that if I'm the widow, I get access to those benefits. That's Obamacare, right? And the vast majority of white people in West Virginia don't want that to happen, right? Because they think that this is something that gives something to black people that they don't deserve. So I don't want to, so I am against this, right? This is you killing you, right? So that would be my message. White supremacy will be the death of us all if we don't address it.
Thank you. Anika.
I actually think I may leave it there. White supremacy will be the death of us all. I'm going to let that mic drop and then let us move on to the questions.
All right. Well, thank you both already for everything that you've contributed. I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Menson, to now begin selecting and asking questions to you.
Okay. Good afternoon again, and thank you so much, Dr. Simpson and Dr. McKinney, for beginning a wonderful conversation. Let me apologize now if I don't get to everyone's questions, because I want to make certain that Dr. McKinney and Dr. Simpson have an opportunity to respond to them fully. But but if you have further questions, we'll make certain that we get them there. What I'd like to do is begin with 3 of the questions that have been posted thus far that refer to kind of the last tab, before the mic drop, Dr. Simpson, of the idea about language, just to kind of keep us in context with that. And then I will go back and address some of the other questions. But I'm looking at one of the first, everyone that was posted there that asked about if we build upon the shifts in language, do you find that calls to defund the police shock those in power? Would this be a way to move from placating power? So if we could talk a little bit more about language with those, and either Dr. McKinney or Dr. Simpson, you can take that one, and then we have 2 more that address the idea of language and reimagining language terms. Dr. Simpson?
Sure. I think people were, I want to be clear. I'm not saying the language, looking at the tenor of the questions, I wasn't saying the language was unimportant. I think it's just the need for new language. I think we still need to deal with the language that we've got now. As far as defunding the police, I don't know if that's so. Again, I tell you, I work within community, so I think that the defund the police, that mantra that's been going out has done a good job of breaking through some of my middle class Black friends who are like, what is this? I mean, the abolition movement, as we've said, has been going on since they brought us here in 1619. So that's not new. That abolishing prisons is not new. But I think for many people to now start hearing, well, what does this defund the police actually mean? And it gives rise on in a more Black mainstream level for people to kind of grapple with what prison abolition would mean. And like, no, you're not just releasing prisoners right now, but to give them a gateway into abolitionist thought.
Thank you. We have another question, actually several in that vein. And Dr. McKinney or Dr. Simpson, you might want to take this one also. Toni Morrison talks about the power of language and the relationship of that power to making meaning. So can the work of sustaining political imagination ever be disentangled from the work of language and inventing vocabularies? And then I want to include another question with it. I think they kind of work hand in hand. Another version of that idea is if language doesn't promote equity and human dignity, should we incorporate more rhetorical instruction? So either both together or individually. Dr. McKinney, you want to begin to address that? Or?
Sure. I see that that question is from Chris Seeley. Hey, shout out to Chris. Good to see you on here. I think that, you know, Mother Morrison is exactly right, and I want to reiterate again to what Dr. Simpson was saying. You know, I'm not suggesting either that, you know, that we shouldn't sort of concern ourselves with new language, right? I'm very concerned about who's producing the language, right? I'm very concerned about, you know, because there is such a thing as people producing language specifically designed to disempower. Right, you know, when we have, for instance, you know, the language of, you know, in my view, right, the language of microaggression, right, you know, the language of, you know, and college and universities speak about diversity and equity and inclusion, right, you know, what happened to racism, right, you know, so the language can be used for, you know, for good and for evil, right, and so so Morrison is exactly right in terms of the ways in which language can be used to, you know, to build upon political imagination. And language is the first, I mean, that's the first tool in the tool belt, right? To think, to dream the freedom dreams, to, you know, to coin a phrase, right? Thinking about Robin Kelly's brilliant work, Freedom Dreams. That's the very first stop in the road to freedom dreams, right? Is the language that we are using, right? You know, the words, the music, the art, right? You know, all of these sort of modes of communication, right? All of these modes have been deployed in the past, are being deployed right now to come up with new language, right? Language related to liberation, language related to abolition, right? So language is foundational to that process, right? And so I think we definitely have to honor that, and clearly, no, that cannot be disentangled from the work of political imagination, because that's literally how we talk about the political imagination and the new political worlds that we are trying to build, right? We use the language to do that. So those two things are inseparable.
I'm going to thank you for that response, Dr. McKinney. One more, I'm going to take more on language, and then we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter movement. I'm trying to keep these kind of thematically, so you all bear with me. The question that was posed with regards to language, is there any consideration being given to Isabel Wilkerson's use of the word caste or caste to diffuse linguistic triggers of words like race, racism, and racist when talking about Black Lives Matter? And you know, that is one of the hottest books right now on the market. Right? Either Dr. Simpson or Dr. McKinney or both, and then we're going to move to some Black Lives Matters.
I will shift that over to my colleague, because it's the hottest book out there. Okay. I've been deep in marriage abolition this summer, so I have not on the list, but I can't.
So I'm about halfway through the book. and I got questions and I got issues, right? You know, I think that, you know, I think that this is not a new conversation, right? The conversation about the word, the use of caste to help think about, you know, we've used this language before, right? And in a previous period, a community of scholars, right? A community of Black scholars, the vast majority of whom, right, you know, white folks don't know anything about because they're Black people, right, doing scholarship before 2010, right? And, you know, and that crew of people said, you know what, caste doesn't get us where we need to go, right? I'm thinking about Oliver Cox. I'm thinking about Du Bois. I'm thinking about, you know, some sort of folks on the Black left who were like, no, this doesn't get us where we need to go, right? You know, this isn't like sort of like gym memberships, right? You know, I joined a gym and I'm tired of this gym, so I'm just going to join a new gym, right? You know, maybe this different set of exercises. You know, instead of biking, I'm going to jog. Instead of jogging, I'm going to swim. You know, I'm going to keep trying new stuff, right? So we've tried this language before, and you know, and some folks whose opinions and thoughts that I really value said it doesn't get us where we need to go, right? And so thus far, I have not read anything in that book that's going to make me change my mind. Now, I'm not done with the book, right? But I haven't seen anything in there yet that says, oh wow, yeah, maybe this is some new language that we need to think about, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to go and we're going to switch gears a little bit to questions specifically about the Black Lives Matters movement, particularly just a larger question from Professor Matlock, and then we have a question from a guest about the Toronto BLM movement and a statement that was made. So to begin with, the first question is, if Black Lives Matter is part of a larger worldwide anti-colonial movement, can we put the colonial genie back in the bottle, or can we decolonize ourselves as a strategy for the future that negates or properly rethinks the past 500 years of colonial capitalist rule? Dr. Simpson, Dr. McKinney. Dr. Simpson, I think he's...
And I put the genie back in the bottle.
I was following his eyes.
Well, no, the genie is out. That's what I'm saying no to that. Can we decolonize ourselves as a strategy for the future? I guess my short answer is yes. I mean, yes, decolonization is a possibility. All I can say is yes. No, the genie is out, and yes. I think this is the whole purpose of this, is to get to decolonization and the decolonial.
Okay. Dr. McKinney, you want to chime in?
I would just add that, you know, history shows us, right, that when we're in the midst of movement, in the midst of struggle, there are titanic debates and arguments being held, right, that are being sussed out in real time, right, and so when we see decisive action, so when we go back to the 1950s, we go back to the 1960s, and we see what we think of as decisive action, right, or decisive sort of documents being produced by people, you know, position papers and things of that nature, right? We always have to realize and understand that those things are happening in real time, right? And so we're in the midst of this cacophony of ideas about what the future can and should look like. And so, you know, I think with the incorporation of new language and with the incorporation of again, the language of, you know, of this anti-colonial moment, and also of the language of decolonization and abolition, right? I think that's a powerful inclusion of language and a powerful inclusion of realities into the mix, right? In terms of helping us think through and think about future prospects and possibilities. So all of that to say, no, that genie's not going back in the bottle, and that's a good thing.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take us back to one of the first questions that was generated of the questions that Dr. Simpson and Dr. McKinney asked for us. And this one, following on the, just kind of following on the coattails of that question, and the idea of language, Dr. McKinney and Dr. Simpson, and how people interpret and how people hear what they hear and say what they say. I think this next question fits into that. It's one of the first, and it asks, what is your take on how the Toronto BLM co-founder has said that white people are recessive, genetic defects, and subhuman? Black people can literally wipe out the white race if we had the power to.
Yeah, I saw that one. I referenced it a little bit earlier. I would not condone violence, but I do understand Black rage and Black anger, and there needs to be space for that. So I think of Dr. McKinney was talking about atrocities that have been committed against Black people. And in moments of seeing, I mean, even the George Floyd video, I couldn't watch it, but for people who sat there for 8+ minutes and watch this man killed, you're going to have a response that may not be the proper response. It may not be the calm response. There are moments where you're going to have Black rage and Black anger, and there needs to be space for that. I read an essay of Ellie Mistel in The Nation earlier this year, as he was talking about the expectation that Black people have superhuman powers. To be in the face of this much violence and dismay, and then expect us to also still remain calm and peaceful and always say the right thing and never show anger is a superhuman power, which I think we've seen with people who are like, I have to wear a mask. People are flipping out over having to wear a mask into Target and getting into fisticuffs over a mask. But you want me to watch a police officer have their knee on the neck of a man who kills them for 8 minutes, and then I just say, okay. So no, I would not condone wiping out anyone, but I do understand the need for anger, and that is a normal human emotion that can be productive as we go to Audre Lorde, we can do all things to the Lord. I mean, there are things that where there are uses of anger that can be productive, but there needs to be space. There's got to be space for Black anger and for Black rage.
Thank you for that. Dr. McKinney?
Yeah, you know, sometimes people say things that might be offensive to you, and you just gotta get over it. Quite frankly, right? But this is also the default mode, right? You know, in the midst of atrocity, this is also part of the atrocity, right? Is awful things happen to Black people, and there's an expectation, particularly by white folks, that regardless of how awful these things are, we're not supposed to at any point in time say anything that might make white people uncomfortable, right? Regardless of the atrocity. Right? So the white man who pulls a gun on my grandfather in front of his children and threatens to end his life, right? My grandfather, according to the white racial gaze, right, to the white, according to the white frame, my grandfather can reference this story, right? But should not, in fact, reference any type of anger he has associated with that story, right? You know, that story should be about how, he went and prayed and, how, Jesus saved him from this white man killing him, how he was so concerned for his son who went off to college, yay, respectability politics, right? But at no point in time should my grandfather, right, express anger about that moment. At no point in time, my grandfather should say anything about, if I'd had a gun, right, blank, 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 right? That's off the table. Right. And the moment we actually, and the moment he moves into, right, this human emotion, which Black folk have been literally denied, then all of a sudden, right, white folks get caught up in their feelings. Right. So, I know we're recording for this is a family show, but, a phrase comes to mind that starts with an F, blank your feelings. Right. Sometimes people say things that might put you on edge, and that's, there's larger fish to fry, and you get over yourself. It's just literally not about you. Keep it moving.
I wonder, Ladrika, if I could just add a sort of elaboration on this question, because Charles, it strikes me that one of the things you're talking about there connects back to something you were talking about earlier, which is it's not just about how white culture has normalized against Black expressions of anger, but if Black people actually get angry, there's a threat of death. The police could be called. I mean, their lives are on the line if they begin to express anger. I wonder if you might address that point.
Well, you know, it's not even, but that's the thing, right? I mean, anger is one of the subcategories of getting the cops called on you, right? In this particular moment, right? You can be asleep in the car and get a cop called on you, right? You can, you know, there's all manner of things that you can do to get the cops called on you, right? None of which have anything to do with anger, right? You can be jogging down the street, you can be asleep in the bed, right? So, you know, you know, and so again, it's just really interesting that, you know, again, regardless of the contexts, right, in which these things happen, right? Part of the framing, part of the, you know, part of the structure of these events, right, is, you know, atrocity, you know, Black person murdered, you know, large, gatherings in that city or around town, lots and lots of calls to remain calm. Violence is not the way, although violence has dotted and shaped the very core and fabric of our society from the moment it was founded, right? You know, let's remain calm. Violence is not a solution. Whose piece of land are you sitting on right now, right? You know, how many people did your family own 150 years ago, right? You know, violence, no violence, no violence. Don't get angry, don't get angry, don't get angry. And then, you know, and even after, we're not going to actually address any of the issues which brought you out into the street to begin with, right? There is still an expectation that you don't get mad or angry, right? Either collectively or individually, right? And so, you know, so this is another part of the process, right? This is another part of the process. Now, am I saying, you know, go out and, you know, burn up some stuff or, you know, tear down some stuff? Not necessarily, but I'm also saying, you know, that Martin King had it right in terms of, you know, the riot is the language of the unheard, right? You know, because there's nothing going on here that we haven't told you about, right? There's nothing happening in the society that people have not articulated in very calm, cool, and collected ways, right? You know, how many more studies do you need about housing inequality? How many more studies do you need about, you know, racial disparities in healthcare? How many more studies do you need? How many more pieces of video do we need to show Black men, women, and children being murdered by the state, and then the state saying, well, you know what, this murder was justified, just like this one, just like this one, just like this one, right? So, you know, at some point in time, there's a limit to people's, right? There's a limit to the civility, right? And so that's the other thing that people have to realize and recognize and acknowledge in this point. And that's going to be that's making itself manifest both in the streets, but also in some other really interesting places.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. Just make sure you all keep me on time with these wonderful questions. I'm going to switch to two questions I think that we could say deal with the idea of institutions and their support of reaction to responses to Black Lives Matter and matters pertaining to the individuals whom this movement, this moment, as you all said so well, is occurring out of all these things that they've already spoken about. So I'm going to begin with the first question. I'm a white pastor at a local church. We supported the Black Lives Matter rally in my city and care deeply about these issues. If appropriate for this discussion, what role can the church play to aid the things suggested here? Dr. Simpson?
The church plays a very large role. So I've been thinking through the relationship between social liberation and spiritual liberation. And in this fight, like we talk about human dignity and just fighting for what I see as just white humanity, that needs to be awakened, and that can't be done for me through legislation or policy. Like, we can't legislate our way to humanity. And I think looking at some of the rhetoric that is coming out of white churches that supports anti-Black racism, I think an intervention in these types of institutions would be very influential, because we need to move beyond just policy. We need to do some spirit work.
Spirit. Dr. McKinney?
What role can the church play? Live up to the standard that you've set for yourselves, right? Jesus, the Bible talks more about poverty than any other social ill. That's the number one problem that's discussed in the Bible. I think that's right. I think I remember that from my subversive Sunday school classes, right? So so if that's the case, then what does that look like in real time, right? And as Dr. Simpson suggested, right, for predominantly white churches, right, you've got another piece of work altogether, right, which is to move away from your white nationalist version of Christianity and move toward a version of Christianity that truly embraces all people. And then when you do that, then then this work starts to take a different shape and can start to look meaningful in some very different and some profoundly different and profoundly more productive and epiphanous ways.
Thank you. So now we'll move to institutional space that we are in right now via Zoom. And that question that leads us there is, what role does the university or college play in conversations about race, activism, civil rights? Is academia complicit in these structures or an ally? You begin first before me.
As I said, I've cut my teeth at an HBCU, but I just coming off a 2-year visiting professor gig at American University, and I have not been at a PWI since I was in Memphis with you all many moons ago, and that was a very shocking experience. So, I think that institutions of higher education have a very large role in both helping us to overcome anti-Black racism, and then also keeping it alive and well as you start looking at hiring practices. I mean, we all know this, especially the Africana philosophy. And I have my own fight. I don't know if any of my colleagues are on this call, but my own fight in my own department, even at Morgan State University. Like, this is the way we do philosophy. This is what the canon is. And I say, I'm looking at this sea of Black faces. This canon is not reaching them. Like, we need to expand the way that we think about philosophy. So how we keep playing out some of these same paradigms and graduating students to go into these institutions and maintain white supremacy is institutions play a very large role.
Dr. McKinney?
What Dr. Simpson said. Institutions do play a very large role, and and institutions are complex places, right? So there are places and spaces that give aid and comfort to movements of liberation, best case scenario, right? And there are places and spaces that are working explicitly against movements of liberation, however you want to define those particular sorts of movements, right? So so part of the challenge in this moment, as always, right, is to render clear assessments of the institutions that we inhabit, right? And again, this isn't rocket science, and this isn't some ancient and unknowable bit of knowledge, right? We all are really clear about the ways that that institutions harm Black people, for instance, right? That's not a mystery, right? When you go into overwhelmingly white spaces and you are, your credentials are challenged, just off the bat, and people make all manner of assumptions about you because you're not a white guy named Bob, right? So we know what those challenges are, right? And then questioning these moments, right, when institutions are sort of forced because of the context of the moment to say, oh, hey, how can we help move forward? right? This is also this is a moment of grand stress, but this is also a moment of opportunity for many of us at certain institutions, right? To say, oh, well, since we want, if we want to talk about this, I got a book here of all manner of stuff that we need to address. And, which chapter do you want to start on, right? So, so this moment can also be seen and should be taken as a moment to move our institutions forward in any small ways that we can.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have followed one last question from the board, and this was actually the first question that was posed. So it takes us back to the way, Dr. McKinney, that you and Dr. Simpson began to historicize and contextualize the Black Lives Matter movement for us for today's discussion. And it went to one of the groups, one of the organizations that works within moments to create a movement. And that question is, will both of you or one of you talk a little bit more about the Black Radical Congress? Again, one of those things that was mentioned early on in the discussion. I think it's a good way to kind of bring us full circle about that. This is something that began out of numerous factors, and for me, just to say, to add on, I think it's really important to recognize, as you noted, that BLM really, the momentum, the idea, is established during the presidency of President Obama, which I don't know, we know how time works. You all know better than I do. But if you could explain a little bit more, either both of you, on the Black Radical Congress, our audience would appreciate that.
So I can start. So the Black Radical Congress was brought together by some scholar activists who were in community with activists on the ground. So basically, if you think of a scholar like Anika Simpson, right, and somebody who's got a foot in the academy and also a foot out in the community, right? This is the cadre of scholars that we're talking about, who in 1998, in June of 1998, came together to create a national organization, right? And the reason they came together was they said, look, there's no daylight between how people are thinking about the Black left and also the Black radical left, right? So they were tired, quite frankly, of sort of the representational politics. They were tired of the inside game, right? They're tired of the assimilationist game, right? The object of the game is for us to be, is for us to grow up to be the Huxtables, right? Is for us to grow up to be the, to be, comfortable middle class folks. And that's the marker of success. There are too many structural inequalities. There are too many barriers. There are too many ways in which Black, poor and working class Black people and poor and working class folks of other colors as well are still being shunted out of and away from the mainstream of American life. So they came together, Barbara Ransby, the late great Manning Marable, Bill Fletcher, Abdul Al-Kamat, pairing with radicals and activists from across the country to create this Congress, right? Again, to create this space of radical possibility, to say literally another world is possible, right? There's only so far, getting, Black folks in Congress is going to get us. There's only so far, Black CEOs are only going to get us so far. More and more Black people on television or MTV or NBC or whatever, that's only going to, the representational respectability game has its limits. And we have reached those limits. So now it's time for us to start thinking through and thinking about and building an infrastructure that helps people to think through and about what some of the other radical possibilities are in terms of how our society can be ordered and in terms of how we can get to where we want to go, right? So this was in 1998.
Thank you for that. I'm going to present one last question. I think is a fitting one for many of us on the call, on the Zoom call, for those of us who are scholars, and also Dr. Simpson and Dr. McKinney. I think this is a question that really, especially despite what we learned today's show, you've spoken about this so well and so calmly and everything for us. And that question is, how do scholars like you handle or manage the rage? How you, and I'm going to make it inclusive for all of us who are scholars on this call who teach. How do we present that? And I know Dr. Simpson, with you, being at Morgan, and then with you, Dr. McKinney, being at Rhodes, and for those of us who are affiliated with U of M and other institutions here, how do we handle the rage and still manage to go into the space and do the work and talk about the work and teach the work and preach the work?
I wasn't being trite when I said there's spirit work to be done. So I'll be a little honest. I went through my Christian phase, and then I went to Spelman and became a philosophy major, and I couldn't do philosophy and Jesus together. Then I graduated, went home, found a church again. Then I came to Memphis, and it was like, Jesus, philosophy can't do it. So I was like, I am this agnostic leaning atheist. But I still needed something, and I found Buddhism, which kind of allows me to do that spirit work without the Jesus. All hail to Jesus. And I say that to say that when I was talking about social liberation and spiritual liberation, being able to find Black Buddhist communities, and that's where I was thinking about Black love and Black anger, because I rage and anger, because I'm reading a book now by Lama Rod Owens about love and rage. So how do we hold those two things in tension, those two things that are intense together, in this work? So meditation, time on the cushion, and finding ways to work through, think through liberatory praxis as human liberation, because we do get caught up with that angry too. Like, we can get rid of all white people. I'm not trying to get rid of. I want to get rid of whiteness. I don't need to get rid of the human beings that are on the planet, and that's very challenging. It's a very challenging thing. And I will just do a shout out to HBCUs. We do not have PWI resources, but I don't know where my rage would be if I was still on American University's campus right now. They have a nice new D&I person. Godspeed to the diversity and inclusion. That's not going to solve the race problems that are happening at American University right now. So I think being in community spaces and also doing some spiritual work on my own helps me to mitigate, to understand what that rage is and not be afraid, be in relationship with anger and understand how that anger is justified, and how it can also be a way to connect in deeper ways on the road to Black liberation.
Thank you. Dr. McKinney.
So that's a word, Dr. Simpson. That is a word. So how do I deal right now? Just not really well, right? I know what I need to do, but sometimes it's overwhelming, right? So when I'm at my best, I am in community with other people, right? I'm in community with other Black folks, so that we can, lick collective wounds, plot plots and schemes and dream about alternatives, right? Dream about otherwise possibilities, as Sean Crawley would say. And so I think that's really probably the most important thing, right? Sort of spiritually, I'm a Christian, but I'm still looking for a place that speaks to this moment, right? And that speaks to the fullness of my humanity, right? So I've found that in a few spaces and places here. Shout out to Abyssinian Baptist Church, Earl Fisher, and Gifts of Life, Andre Johnson, and a couple of other spaces. But yeah, I think it's really important, right? That to find that sense of community, find a place where you can laugh and cry and and debrief, but also a place where you can plot and schemes, right? Because I think that's also a foundation, a really essential part of the work. I want to give a shout out to the HBCUs. Good to see my Spelman sisters in the house, Dr. Simpson and Dr. Minson Furr, and I see a couple of other folks on here. I see my Morehouse brother, Corey Reed. So shout out to the HBCU crew, and shout out to because that's 4 years of not having to worry about this by and large, right? I spent 4 years in a space and place where nobody asked me if I was on the athletic scholarship, right? Where the public safety didn't stop me and ask me for my ID, like the 12 times they did in my first semester at Rhodes College, right? So that was an anchor for me, right? In terms of building my capacity to be in these other sorts of spaces and places, right? I know who I am. And that's also a function of HBCU, but it's also a function of the communities that brought me up, right? I know who I am. I know whose I am. I know my value and I know my worth, right? And I know the value and worth of others, right? And so, like Dr. Simpson said too, right? And I'm not necessarily mad at white people, although y'all be acting up sometimes. I am though mad at whiteness, right? And and all of the and the magnificent array of awful things whiteness drives white people and sometimes non-white people to do, right? All skin ain't kin, right? Some of y'all know what that means, right? So yeah, I think community is essential. Community is crucial in terms of survival and also figuring out ways to flourish.
Well, thank you, Dr. Simpson and Dr. McKinney, for responding to our audience's questions. I'm so glad this is recorded. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Deb, so we can, unfortunately, we have to end this conversation because of time, but this has been brilliant. Thank you all so much.
Yes, let me reiterate my thanks to both of you for joining us. I think this was an hour and a half of scheming in a way and some thinking about otherwise possibilities. And I want to come back to the other thought that, this is so important that we think of this as just one conversation among many. As I think Dr. McKinney said before, many moments make a movement. And I hope that you feel that this was a part of one and that you are a part of one. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Menson for agreeing to help me with the questions and being the moderator for the Q&A. Thank you. And thank you to the Marcus Orr Center for the Humanities and to everybody here who showed up to listen and be honest and share your thoughts and put up questions. Can't have a conversation without that either. But I guess the last thing I want to say is instead of announcing the title as a title, I want to finish with it as an affirmation. Black Lives Matter. So let's keep that thought, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you again, Dr. McKinney and Dr. Simpson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having us.
Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining this colloquium.